She was 19 when the rain started following her into the mountains. By the time Anna crossed the Nalachaki River, everything she owned fit inside a single duffel bag resting beside her boots on the bus seat. Her mother was gone. The trailer had been sold 3 weeks earlier, and the only thing she had managed to buy with the money she had left was an abandoned railway depot no one in eastern Tennessee seemed to remember anymore. The building sat beside a dead freight spur surrounded by wet weeds and pine fog, with rain tapping softly against the metal roof like someone trying not to wake the past. But on her first night there, after the stove finally warmed the waiting room, Anna found a brass railway watch still ticking inside the locked stationmaster's office. And someone had wound it recently. Before we begin, take a moment to subscribe to Echoes of the Dust and tell us in the comments what forgotten place has stayed in your memory all these years. The bus left her at the edge of town just after 5, when the light was already gone from the sky and the rain had settled into the kind of steady, purposeless fall that doesn't announce itself or apologize. Anna stood on the gravel shoulder with her duffel bag and watched the taillights disappear around a bend in the mountain road. Then there was only the sound of the rain and the dark tree line and, somewhere beneath both of those, the faint smell of iron. She had the address on a folded piece of paper, but she didn't need it. The depot was the only structure visible from the road, a long, low building set back from a pair of rails that disappeared in both directions into the fog. It was not beautiful. The paint had long since given up, and the gutters hung at mild angles, and the wooden platform that fronted the building had developed a patient list toward the earth. But the windows were whole. That was the first thing she noticed. Every window intact, the glass clouded with age, but unbroken, and in the dusk they held what little light remained in the sky, like something preserved in them deliberately. She crossed the wet gravel and stepped onto the platform, her boots loud against the boards. The door was unlocked. Inside, the waiting room was cold in a way that felt structural, as if the cold had been there long enough to become part of the building's material. There were wooden benches bolted to the floor in 2 facing rows, a ticket window sealed with a rusted grill, and at the far end of the room a cast-iron potbelly stove that sat on its 4 legs like a small, patient animal. The floor was swept. Not recently there was a fine gray film over everything but swept, as though someone had made an effort at some point, and the effort had simply held. She set her bag on the nearest bench and stood still for a moment, listening to the rain on the metal roofing. It was a specific sound, almost musical, each drop finding its register in the corrugated steel overhead. She had not planned to feel anything about the sound. She felt something anyway. The kindling beside the stove was dry. Someone had left it there split pine in a careful stack with a folded square of newspaper wedged underneath, dated 3 winters ago. She lit it without letting herself think too much about who had left it or why, and she fed the fire slowly, and after a while the warmth began to move through the room the way warmth does in old buildings, unevenly, touching the walls last. She ate a can of soup she'd brought in her bag, and then sat on the bench nearest the stove and watched the fire through the grate. The rain continued. A freight train passed sometime around midnight, far enough away that she felt it more than heard it, a low vibration in the floor, a resonance in the old glass, and then it was gone, and the rain came back. Before she slept, she walked the room once more with the small flashlight from her bag. The ticket window. The locked door at the back, stenciled Stationmaster in faded black letters. The old schedule board with its hand-lettered departures, the names of towns she didn't recognize. She ran the flashlight along the baseboards, the ceiling beams, the brass fittings on the door. Nothing unusual, and then, on a narrow shelf beside the stationmaster's door, sitting in a small wooden cradle as though it had always lived there, a brass railway watch. She picked it up. It was wound. She could feel the faint pulse of the mechanism in her palm, the tick so clean, and even it seemed almost conscious. She turned it over. The case was worn smooth at the edges from years of handling, but the crystal was unscratched, and the hands were precisely set. Someone had kept it wound. She set it back in the cradle and turned off the flashlight and lay down on the bench with her coat pulled over her shoulders. She listened to the rain and, beneath the rain, the watch. She was almost asleep when she turned the flashlight back on and looked again at the lock on the Stationmaster's door. She didn't know what made her do it. Something about the handle, the way it caught the light. She leaned closer. The keyhole was clean, not just unrusted oiled. Recently, from the look of it, the metal carrying a faint dark gleam that the rest of the hardware in the room did not have. She turned the flashlight off and lay back down. Someone had been here. Not long ago. Someone who wound watches and oiled locks and left split kindling in careful stacks. She listened to the rain for a long time before she slept. She did not decide to stay so much as she failed to leave. The first morning she told herself she would clean the waiting room, because it needed cleaning and she had nothing else to do, and motion had always been easier for her than stillness. She found a broom behind the stove and a bucket and a cloth, and she worked through the morning with the methodical attention she had once applied to other things, to other lives, in other places, and by noon the floor was clear, and the windows had been wiped, and the benches stood straight in their rows. She noticed, cleaning, that the damage was less than it appeared. The gutters needed rehanging, not replacing. 2 boards in the platform were soft, but the frame beneath them was sound. The clock above the ticket window had stopped, but when she stood on the bench and examined the mechanism through the glass face, she saw nothing obviously broken, only a spring that needed winding and a gear that had drifted from its mount. This was, she understood, different from neglect. Neglect collapsed things. What had happened here was more like suspension, as if someone had simply paused everything at a particular moment and left it waiting for the pause to end. She found the journals on the 3rd day, in a wooden crate behind the ticket window, 12 identical ledgers in marbled black covers, each one labeled with a year in the same neat hand. She opened the oldest one 40 years back and read a single entry about a stuck signal lamp and a delayed coal freight written in the same careful cursive as the years that followed. She did not read further. Not yet. She set the journals in order on the shelf beneath the schedule board and went back to work. The man appeared on the 4th morning. He came on foot from the direction of town, carrying a canvas tool bag, and he stepped onto the platform without ceremony and looked at the rehung gutter and the replaced boards and said nothing for a long moment. Bellamy always used number 8 screws in the platform, he said finally. You'll want to pull those and use the right size, or they'll work loose again by spring. His name was Garrett. He was old enough to have retired twice and lean enough that his coat hung off him like something borrowed. He had worked the line for 31 years before it closed, the last few as a conductor on the overnight mountain run. He did not explain why he had come or how he knew she was there. He simply sat on the platform railing and watched her work, and occasionally offered the kind of quiet correction that assumed she wanted to learn. He showed her how to regulate the clock, how to adjust the pendulum length for the temperature, how to feel in the mechanism for the resistance that meant a gear needed cleaning rather than replacement. He brought oil and a set of small tools in their own worn roll of canvas. He did not stay long on any given day, but he came back every morning. On the 8th day she made coffee. It was an impulsive thing. She had found a small tin of grounds in the drawer beneath the ticket window and a stovetop pot in the cabinet, and she made it without deciding to, and poured 2 cups and set one on the railing beside Garrett without asking if he wanted it. He drank it without commenting. The next morning he brought a bag of fresh grounds from town. There were others after that. An older woman who walked from the upper road and sat on the bench nearest the stove for 20 minutes before walking back. A man who stood on the platform for a while and looked at the rehung gutters and nodded slightly and left. They did not announce themselves or explain. They came and looked and went. Anna noticed, but did not ask. The discovery of the envelopes came 2 weeks in, when she was cataloging the desk drawers more carefully. They were tucked inside the back pages of a ledger from 15 years ago, 6 white envelopes, sealed, with names written on the front in the same careful hand as the journals. Inside the first one, which she opened because the name on it was one she didn't recognize, and the glue had already failed, $40 in small bills, folded around a note that said only for the fair if you need it. No questions. She sat with it for a long time. Then she opened the others. They were all the same: the money, the note, the same phrasing. 6 names. 6 quiet provisions, waiting in the ledger for people who might never come back for them. She replaced them carefully and went to find Garrett on the platform. "The envelopes," she said. He looked at his coffee cup. Bellamy had a long memory for people who came through in difficult times, he said. He believed in having something ready. She thought about that. How many? "More than 6, Garrett said. Those were just the ones he hadn't delivered yet. She went back inside and stood at the stationmaster's door for a moment, the oiled lock, the faded lettering, and then she sat at the desk and opened the oldest journal and began, properly, to read. His name, written in full at the front of each ledger, was Walter James Bellamy, and he had served as stationmaster of the depot for 34 years, from the line's modest peak through its long, unhurried decline, and into the silence that followed. He had been there when the passenger service ended, and when the freight runs thinned to twice weekly, and when those 2 finally stopped. He had locked the depot that last night and gone home. Then, according to the earliest entry in the journal she was now reading, written 3 days after the official closure, he had come back. Came in to check the boiler seal. Brought oil for the platform hardware. The building is sound. It will keep, if it's kept. And so, he had kept it, entry by entry across years that the railroad had already forgotten, a replaced pane of glass, a treated beam, a rewound clock. Not preservation as monument, he had not embalmed the place or kept it as it was. He had simply maintained its function. He had kept it ready. She read about the storms. In the second winter after closure, a family had been stranded on the mountain road during a 3-day ice event and had found the depot unlocked and the stove stocked with wood and a note on the bench that said, "Use what you need, leave what you can." Walter had written about them in half a page, not their names, which he did not know, but the sound of the children settling into sleep on the benches and the way the father had restacked the wood before they left, more neatly than he had found it. There were others. A woman traveling alone who had stopped for a night and left in the morning with a train voucher Walter had quietly arranged through an old contact at the regional office. A man who had sat in the waiting room for 3 days without speaking, eating from the small supply of tinned food Walter kept in the cabinet and had eventually left without explanation, and for whom Walter had felt, he wrote, only hope. A group of teenagers sheltering from a sudden summer storm who had been offered cold water and asked no questions, and who had, without being asked, swept the platform before leaving. The depot had not been abandoned. It had been quietly, continuously offered. Anna set the journal down and looked at the room around her, the clean floor, the straight benches, the clock now ticking steadily above the ticket window, the coffee warming on the stove. Outside, the first snow of the season was falling, and the light through the windows had gone that particular gray-white that snow gives to an afternoon, and someone had left a pair of boots on the platform that she didn't recognize. Garrett came in with his canvas bag and sat on the bench opposite her without ceremony. He knew it would be someone, Anna said. Garrett set his bag down. He said it would have to be someone who noticed things. Not someone looking for something, someone who noticed. He said those were different people. She thought about the fresh oil in the lock, the dry kindling stacked by someone's careful hand, the watch wound and waiting. He prepared it, she said. He prepared everything he could, Garrett said. The rest he left to the building. They worked that afternoon on the clock tower, replacing the deteriorated mounting bracket and cleaning 30 years of grime from the bell mechanism. It was slow, precise work, and cold at the height of the tower, and they did it mostly in silence. When they came back down, the snow was 2 inches deep on the platform and still falling. And someone had knocked and found the door and was sitting inside near the stove, an older man Anna had not seen before, in a wet coat, with a small bag at his feet, and the look of someone who had been traveling a long time. She poured him coffee and asked no questions. That night, after Garrett had gone and the man in the wet coat had thanked her quietly and left for the motel in town, she sat at the desk and took out the brass watch. She had been winding it herself every evening before she slept, a habit she had not consciously decided to form. She wound it now and set it on the desk and listened to it tick. Then it stopped. She felt a small panic and looked at the crown, thinking she had overwound it, but the mechanism was fine. She picked it up and held it level and gave it a slight turn, and it resumed, not with effort, but with the clean, certain sound of something that had simply paused, briefly, for reasons of its own. She looked at the window. Snow against the glass. The light of the stove on the walls. Somewhere down the mountain, a freight horn in the dark. She understood. Sitting there, what Walter had understood over 34 years of quiet work. The building did not remember being a station. It was a station. It had simply been waiting for someone to act accordingly. She set the watch back on the desk and listened to it tick and thought about what it meant to be expected somewhere. It was not a small thing. She stopped keeping her bag packed sometime in December. She couldn't have said exactly when, only that one morning she noticed it unzipped on the floor of the back room, half emptied, her things distributed into the shelves and hooks she had cleared, and that the sight of it did not produce the familiar readiness, the low-level preparation for departure that had been her background state for years. She left it where it was. She didn't zip it back up. The depot opened itself, slowly, the way spaces do when someone begins to treat them as permanent. She had started leaving the front lamp on in the evenings, an amber light through the old glass that was visible from the road, and people found their way to it the way people always move toward warmth and light in winter. Not many, 3 or 4 at a time, on most evenings. But they came, and they stayed an hour, and they drank coffee, and sat on the benches, and sometimes talked and sometimes did not, and when they left they did so without being made to. Garrett had begun bringing others with him in the mornings. A retired schoolteacher who had known Walter and contributed, over several weeks, a complete account of the depot's first 2 decades. A young man from the Upper Valley who arrived asking if there was anything useful he could do, and who rewired 3 of the overhead fixtures by the end of January. The woman who had sat near the stove in the early weeks began bringing her sister, and then a neighbor, and the morning coffee had become, without anyone naming it, a thing that happened daily. The clock tower was restored in February. It was a quiet day, overcast, the mountains invisible behind cloud, and when Garrett threw the coupling and the bell sounded once across the valley, clear and low and resonant in the cold air, Anna stood on the platform and felt the sound pass through her chest and said nothing because there was nothing adequate to say. She found Walter's final journal entry on a Tuesday in early March, tucked between the last ledger and the back wall of the shelf, written on a single sheet folded into thirds and labeled in the same careful hand. For whoever comes after. It was not a letter of instruction. She had half-expected instructions, a list of tasks, a set of protocols for the building's maintenance. There were none. It was 4 paragraphs in which an old man set down, as plainly as he could, what he had come to understand about the depot over 3 decades of solitary care. That places, he wrote, built to connect people develop something like intention, not intelligence, not sentience, but a quality of waiting that is structural, that becomes part of what the building is. That his job had not been to preserve the building. His job had been to preserve its availability, to keep it in a condition of readiness for a purpose it had not yet been called to fulfill. He had not known who would come. He had been reasonably confident that someone would. If you are reading this, he had written, you are the reason I kept going. I hope the building treats you as well as it has treated me. That evening the snow came again, heavier than it had all winter, and word spread through town the way it does in small places, and by 7 o'clock there were 11 people in the waiting room, and the stove working at capacity, and a child asleep across 2 of the benches under someone's coat. Outside, the freight horns moved through the mountain passes every hour or so, their sound dampened by the snow into something almost soft. Anna stood at the window and watched the flakes fall through the amber light from the platform lamp, each one briefly visible before the dark took it. A small girl, the daughter of the couple from the upper road, came and stood beside her at the window. "What are you looking at?" she asked. "The snow," Anna said. "And the light. The way the light looks when there's something to fall through." Later, after most people had gone, she sat at the desk and took out the brass watch. The girl had asked her, earlier in the evening, how it worked, not the mechanism, but the fact of it. The fact of it still running after so long. Anna had tried to explain that someone winds it, she had said. Every day someone has to wind it. The girl had thought about this and then said, quite seriously, I could do that, and Anna had said yes, she could, and had shown her how, the proper pressure, the number of turns, the sound that meant it was fully wound. Now she wound it herself, once more, in the quiet of the late room. The fire ticked. The snow fell beyond the glass. Down the dark length of the valley, the last freight of the night sounded its horn once, long and low, and was answered by nothing but the mountains and the silence that came after. She set the watch in its cradle. She turned down the lamp. She locked the door. Places built to connect people remember their purpose long after the people are gone. Maybe that's true for people too. She walked home through the snow, and the light from the depot windows followed her a long way before the road turned and the trees closed in and the night came gently down. What place in your life still feels like it remembers you?